Good evening, everyone. My name is Anne Reeve, and I am an associate curator at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. And it is a pleasure to welcome you all this evening for this conversation with the artist Abigail DeVille. The Hirshhorn has been and is honored to host her work, Light of Freedom, in our sculpture garden, which is open daily from 10 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. And if you have not had a chance to visit yet in person, I strongly suggest and hope that you make the trip down to the National Mall to do so. Perhaps tonight's conversation will provide a little extra encouragement. By way of a brief introduction, Abigail was born in New York and received her MFA from Yale University in 2011 and her BFA from the New York Fashion Institute of Technology from FIT in 2007. Recent exhibitions of her work include Brand New Heavies at Pioneer Works in Brooklyn, New York, which was open earlier this year in the spring, and the exhibition The American Future at the Portland Institute of Contemporary Art. DeVille's work has been exhibited widely in the US, including at the Whitney, the ICA in Los Angeles, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the New Museum in New York, and internationally at the Punta della Dogana in Venice, Italy, and the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. DeVille has also designed sets for theatrical productions at venues such as the Stratford Festival, which is directed by Peter Sellers, in this country at the Harlem Stage, La Mama, and Joe's Pub, all for productions directed by Charlotte Braithwaite. She has received the Award of Honors Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. She is a Creative Capital grantee. She has received an Obie Award for Design, and she was nominated for the Future Generation Art Prize at the 55th Venice Biennale. Also in Italy, she was the Chuck Close, Henry W. and Marion T. Mitchell Rome Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Rome in 2017 and 2018. She currently teaches in Baltimore at the Maryland Institute College of Art and is also a critic at her alma mater, Yale. As her bio suggests, she is an artist with a multidisciplinary approach. It is, however, always grounded in history, and DeVille mines the overlooked and often traumatic histories of Black and Brown Americans in order to spotlight cultural contradictions and inequities, and to ask questions about how we experience and understand the world through our shared narrative histories. In the summer of 2020, in the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police, she was commissioned by the Madison Square Park Conservancy in New York to create a public sculpture. And what she created ultimately was this work titled Light of Freedom. It stands about 13 feet tall and consists of a metal armature in the shape of the Statue of Liberty's torch, which is in turn suspended from gold painted scaffolding. A flame of tangled painted mannequin limbs flickers out from the top, and a bell sits within the armature below this flame and is silent. The work went on view in Madison Square Park in the autumn of 2020, and then it traveled to the Momentary at Crystal Bridges in Arkansas, and then last month it made its way to the Hirshhorn Sculpture Garden on the National Mall. To mark its arrival in Washington, Abigail developed an original sunrise performance, which was titled Wake Up, Liberation Call at Dawn, alongside collaborators, including the vocalist Jadelle McPherson, the DC-based West African drumming group Farafina Khan, and the Jogo Project, which is a DC band which melds jazz and go-go. And for those of us lucky enough to have been there, it really was a truly memorable experience, and we hope to share, or we plan to share, some video from that performance tonight. This evening, Abigail and I are planning to speak about the work, Light of Freedom, and this performance, their genesis, what it means to have them cited here on the National Mall, and if we have time, we'll look at some other work of hers as well. The plan is to speak for about 45 minutes and then open it up to you all for Q&A, so please, if you have questions at any point throughout the hour, just use the prompt at the bottom of your screen and please share them with us. For now, I will ask Abigail to turn on her camera. Hello.
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good.
Good. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have, I think you know that we have been so thrilled to bring this work here to DC where it can sit on the mall alongside all of these other monuments and memorials. We're very grateful to our partners at Madison Square Park Conservancy for helping to make it possible. And to start, I thought, or I hoped maybe we could go back to this Frederick Douglass quote.
Mhm.
And you can take us to this moment in the summer of 2020 when the ask first came through to develop a work for Madison Square Park, and how this quote maybe grounded your thinking in that moment.
So yeah, when Brooke initially contacted me, I was like beyond thrilled. I feel like Madison Square Park is definitely a space that you dream about making something for. And I think it was around June 11th, but I needed more information about the history of the park, which they so generously provided. And that's really how everything is grounded. It's about the specific things that happen within a particular location. And anyway, okay, so I will read this quote right now before I go any further. But this quote helped me think through think through the moment and actually what was possible in making for an engaged public.
Mhm.
Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all absorbing, and for the time being, putting all other tumults to silence. It must do this or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. And so that was taken from a Frederick Douglass speech that he gave in Canandaigua, New York, about West Indian emancipation, August 3rd in 1857.
So how did the research proceed from that point? How did you work your way to the iconography of the Statue of Liberty as something to speak to the moment and to your preoccupations and concerns in that moment?
I wanted to see what histories had already taken place on that land or that are embedded within that land of Madison Square Park. And then I think initially they sent me a couple of books about the history of the park. And then also I watched Rick Burns' New York documentary. I think it's about 7 or 8 parts. And in it also in that documentary, there is a photograph of the Statue of Liberty's hand and torch in Madison Square Park when it was installed in, I'm dropping the years, but in the 1870s, yeah, sometime.
I think we have an image of that on the
Yeah.
next slide. Yeah, there we
So
go.
as soon as I saw this image, I was just like, okay, the project is done. I already know what I'm doing. History has already done it for me. But
So why was it there? What
so
did you
it
learn
was
about why
there.
it was there?
Yeah, it was there as part of like a fundraising project. So the artist, the sculptor, Frederick Auguste Bartoli, who designed the Statue of Liberty, it took maybe from conception to completion about 20 years. It was a 20-year process. And during that time period, when the Statue of Liberty was being constructed in France, they were, furiously trying to raise funds for Americans to contribute for the building of the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. And so this portion was sent from Paris to participate in a World's Fair in Philadelphia. I think it was marking maybe the 100th anniversary of the United States itself. And then it traveled to New York and was installed in the park, I think, for a period of 6 years. So it was just to encourage people to give to this effort because, as you know, then and now, so certain things are unchanged, but this was all private money that went into the construction of this work of art, even though it's like completely founded and embroiled in political conversations and has been used as this icon or tool to be pro or against immigration and different kinds of freedom mythologies that are embedded into the ways in which we think about American democracy. But no government, the French government and the American government did not fund this project whatsoever. So it was like working class people of France that contributed their money to the building of it as a gift for Franco-American friendship. And then it was more working class folks here on this side who contributed to the construction of the pedestal.
Mhm. I want to get to all of the material choices that you made as you developed
Mhm.
the work because they're so specific and intentional. But I guess before that, I am curious, just in general, about making work with such a sense of immediacy, because you speak about using history as sort of raw material, and clearly you're doing that in this case as well. And it's looking to a very long arc of history, often back hundreds of years. This country's, very often violent subjugation of many, many people. But in this instance, you were also working in also something of a reactive mode, right? Very much in real time in relation to George Floyd and the sort of energy of that summer and urgency of that summer. And I just was wondering if it feels or does anything different when you're working in that way.
I think maybe in terms of like the thoughtfulness of a response, right? Like how
Mhm.
can, and then I think that's where history aids in that, like in providing a kind of a libertas icon, right? That everyone associates with American democracy, right? And the ways in which this hypocrisy has been embedded in all of our icons or the ideals in which that we hold so dear or kind of put our trust or faith or belief in that could potentially be fully realized or real.
Mhm.
Uh, so I think, yeah, like not saying that the Statue of Liberty was a safe bet, but I mean, it's something we all understand. And if this was something that was to like address a particular moment, then I didn't want anything that was going to be, that anyone would need to be scratching their head about, but thinking about the contradictions that are already built
Yeah.
into the form.
Yeah. And I mean, the recognizability of it is, I don't think I fully grasped the universality of the way that that symbol is absorbed and sort of integrated to all of us until we were installing your work on the mall. And before it was even fully up, people were walking by and immediately able to recognize what was in essence a completely disembodied fragment of that overall image, just because it is so prominent and prevalent in the way all of us, especially in this country, I think, are socialized, right? It becomes, sort of reinforced the power and the intensity of the image itself. So what are we looking at here on screen?
This actually was the restoration of the Statue of Liberty in the 1980s. And so the the picture on the left is what the original install was of the torch. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was in the restoration in the 1980s, they went more with the with Bartoli's original design. And so the
Mm-hmm.
first one is more, it was a lighthouse originally when it was originally installed. And so that's why those glass window panes are there. And so when I saw these images, I instantly was struck by the beauty and the density of the scaffolding around the torch. And so that's how I got the idea for the scaffold around the torch to begin with, because I mean, I'm just really hot for scaffolding in general, but like, and then when I saw
Talk
this, I
about
was just
that.
like,
Talk about what
whoa.
makes you hot for scaffolding. I
Well,
want
I
to.
mean, as scaffolding is, it's like ancient technology, right? Like we haven't thought of anything better since, like the ancient world of how to construct things, right? And it's this just immediate thing that connects us to our ancient past. But and it's really beautiful to look at. I mean, like the density and the complexity of lines and thinking about the weight that it supports. But yeah, so as soon as I saw that, I was thinking about, yes, this actual struggle or monumental effort to fully realize what freedom or individual freedom means in American democracy, that is like this unfulfilled promise, which is which was the reactionary thing of, the summer of 2020.
Yeah. Well, let's look at some images. I think we can maybe start to scroll through of you starting to build out the work in New York. And so you mentioned the scaffolding, and this armature is suspended from the scaffolding and sort of lilting. Can you talk about the mannequin arms, how that came together for you, and the decision to paint them the color that they are painted?
Well, I think that was also in part in thinking about how the Statue of Liberty was funded in the first place, or how this even operates as this icon for democracy, but thinking about all the kind of collective individuals that contributed, their pennies to making this thing happen in the first place, right? Like this is very much a working class icon, right? Even if it's based on this Greco-Roman goddess, right? So it does represent like this collective individual freedom, whatever democracy means, and how that's played out from either country. And I think that's what I was really thinking about, the individual contributions, but also our own individual contributions in real time, right? With like people going out and, linking arm in arm and protesting last summer, but the long tradition of protest and struggle for everything that everything has to be continually fought for in order to get anywhere in maybe life, but specifically in this nation's history. So I was thinking about that, right? Like actually the power of an individual and how hot like the intensity of that effort can burn, and how those are the things that are passed from generation to generation. That's the legacy of American democracy, that it's a struggle and not that it's actually a given. And so thinking about showing these bodies, and then in terms of coloring them or painting them blue, like blue is the hottest flame that exists. And so that's why I stuck them in there within the flame, because that's the thing that makes this engine keep running, right? Is the collective belief in it, right? So then thinking about that everyone buys into this belief, and so that's why that's why it endures.
Yeah, the fuel. Um, what about the bell that is embedded within that armature? You can sort of see it in the middle of the
Mhm.
image there on the left.
Yeah, the bell is a decommissioned school bell from Illinois that I found on eBay, actually. And I was thinking about, you know, just the ways in which, that it is a call of freedom, right? But then also it doesn't, you can't actually ring it. So it's kind of like it's wedged within this thing, but it can't actually cry out. And then thinking about the ways in which, we think that education is, like a basic right, or that it's a right of living within this nation. And so thinking about the ways in which that has also continually been compromised, I think, from the very beginning. Um, so that's why it's hanging out in there.
Just-
And also for
um,
the birds, right? For the birds to
yeah,
enjoy.
they're enjoying it. They're enjoying it. Um, and then I guess the final question I have just about the look of the thing is about the color of the scaffolding itself, because it's painted gold. So,
Yeah, so I wanted the torch to have this like rusty kind of patina, and thinking about this ancient idea, um, that's uh, continually being fueled, but then thinking about the construction, like the monumental effort that goes into like the upholding of this idea, and the ways in which, like thinking about these scaffolds that are built, in which like even with the Emma Lazarus poem, or 19th century rhetoric, or even thinking about 21st century conversations about immigration that are ongoing, the ways in which people can come here and then ascend this kind of scaffold, or going up and down, right? This kind of scaffolding. So think about the ways in which immigrant or migrant bodies are valorized for their labor, but also dehumanized and have no value within American society, right? Like
Yeah.
America wants your labor, but they don't actually want your body or your family or your descendants. Or thinking about the ways, I think Toni Morrison also talks about um, the melting pot, that Black people are actually the pot, that everybody else gets to get stewed into the mix of whatever America is, whatever that stew is, and that Black people are continually on the fire. So thinking about that Black people remain, kind of at the bottom of the scaffolding, and it doesn't matter how long you've been here. Within, a couple generations, you could be like president of the United States, like the Kennedys. I remember James Baldwin has an infamous quote about that, right? About, I think Bobby Kennedy said in the 1960s about that, things are progressing so well that, within a few decades, there might even be a Black president, and he's like, well, y'all just got here. And you telling us if we're good, then maybe in a few more decades, we too might ascend to the highest, realms of power within this nation. But
Right. No, I mean the rise that's part of the American ideal, right?
idea, yeah.
It's not, it doesn't take place in a vacuum, right? People aren't floating up. They're pushing others down, or historically, right? And have been climbing on the backs of the labor of others. And then painting it gold.
Yeah, like I think
Was that, I mean, I think of the gold on the flame of the torch of the Statue of Liberty itself. Was that in there at all?
I think that was in there, but I think, yeah, I was really thinking about like the valoration of monumental effort.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Um, well, let's scroll through to some images of it newly installed on the mall in the garden, because it was sort of born out of such a specific relationship to the history of Madison Square Park in that particular site, but it does seem to take on new energy, or a different kind of energy on the National Mall itself, sort of alongside all of these other monuments and memorials. And you actually oriented the flame when you were on site to face the US Capitol. And so I was just hoping to hear a little bit from you about what the site does here and what it does with and for the site in your mind.
Well, I think it's really important that it's there, like aside from the events of January 6th, but thinking about how the mall represents all of these different kinds of, I don't know, not vacuums, but vast repositories of knowledge, right? Like what, how America envisions itself, or what you need to know, right? Like about history and the things that we think are important, right? And it's free to go to, right? I mean, it's not really free to go to any museums anywhere else in the United States. So I think how it's really like it's a cliff notes into like how we envision the best of ourselves, aside from the events that happen, and then thinking about its position to the Capitol, and how Thomas Crawford's sculpture on the top of the Capitol dome was originally modeled after the Roman goddess Libertas. So there is a direct connection to that, and thinking through these personified bodies of women that are, can confer freedom in how we envision ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I think of it, I think of the mall sometimes as an arena where like America is performing itself for others, right? And it's very glossy, and it's very, like muscular and shiny, and having this here and sort of, insisting that we all acknowledge this sort of slippage between the way we like to perform our ideals as a nation and our actions as a nation, and the way that those ideals manifest very messily on the ground, to me was sort of especially, it was and is especially sort of powerful to see and experience on the Mall. I like that it's in there. I like that it's punctuating everything else on this field at the moment. Well, maybe that's a good, speaking about the Mall, speaking about its arrival on the Mall, maybe that's a good segue into talking a little bit about the performance. And before we do, maybe, Amy, I know you need a little time to make a transition to a short video clip that we have that is cut together from the performance, which took place at sunrise in the garden on October 15th. It was a Friday morning. And yeah, we'll get into it, but let's watch this first.
I woke up this morning. Oh, and I get to feel so hallelujah.
That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is happiness? Happiness is the ability to call forth the name smudge out of history's ledger.
Thanks, Amy. That makes me smile. Seeing your dress makes me smile, and reliving some of those moments, because there were a lot of people in the garden that morning. There was a lot of energy, and it was pretty spectacular to sort of feel that and feel, it's a sunken garden, and to feel kind of enveloped by that sound as it was sort of building and wrapping around all of us, as the sun was coming up. So why sunrise?
Why not?
Here. When we talked about it, you were like, drama.
Yes, I'm all about the drama.
Yeah. But
yeah, I mean, I think like making again that correlation, like, oh, it's a new day. But also it's kind of the same as yesterday. Maybe it's not as bad as yesterday. Maybe there's new light, or there's always new light to kind of stretch forward towards. But yeah, I mean, yeah, thinking about, the rising of the sun in correlation to it, like an internal flame, like burning, as that's representative in the mannequin arms and the torch.
So how did your thinking first start to kind of germinate and develop when you were thinking through how to approach this performance in the first place?
I was thinking about I guess like the composition within the garden, or how it was structured, and thinking about where people could perform, and there are symbols that come from the Congo that African Americans have used for centuries, like embedded in yard work and yard gardens and architecture. I mean, one symbol in particular is called a diamond star. So it just looks like a diamond, but it's thinking about the all-seeing eye of God, and it connects you to the ancestors. And so the thinking about having the drummers being at those four cardinal points also in a way made this diamond star.
Mm.
So continually thinking about those kinds of simple geometries and structures that like harken back over centuries. And then, so I know I knew we needed drumming also because I was originally thinking about the Stono Rebellion of 1739, but thinking about the kinds of rebellions in conjunction with like the actions of January 6th, or thinking about the ways in which we're taught American history in early education and in elementary school, and the ways in which this information is presented to us, and then in other ways in which we never hear about these other kinds of freedom struggles where people were either, you know, fighting against colonizers for their ancestral lands and indigenous history, or, you know, Africans pushing back and emancipating themselves through different rebellions. And actually in the 1730s, there were numerous rebellions in the Caribbean and in the United States against, you know, people who were being enslaved and fighting against that. And then in particular, this one that I was really taken with the Stoner Rebellion.
About that.
Hmm?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
that one. So those people, I mean, the thing that got me about them was it happened on a Sunday in September in 1739, and they, you know,
Carolinas, right?
yeah, yeah, I think in South Carolina. So it's somewhere very close to Charleston, but they took guns from a general store, murdered the store owner, murdered other families in the town, and then started moving southward on I think it's US Highway 17 today, but it was Kings Highway in that moment. And they were drumming as they went down the highway, and they were holding a banner that said liberty, right? And so the ways in which we think about liberty for the colonists who were being, you know, overtaxed or abused by, you know, the British government, versus actually people being stolen from where they were from and then being, you know, enslaved for generations and forced to, you know, labor for free. But, you know, them moving along, it was the call of the drum, right, that brought other people from other plantations to join them until, you know, maybe it started out with a group of about 20 people until it was about a group of 100, and they kept moving down. They spared people who actually were considered to be kind masters, and everybody else, you know, were killed. It didn't last very long, but thinking about, that's actually a freedom struggle that I was not taught, you know, growing up, right? Like that's a freedom struggle they're not going to tell you about, right? Like that's another kind of alternative hero to which I had kept mentioning earlier, like Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, right? Like
Right.
the things that were taught. But actually, Paul Revere's Midnight Ride was popularized by what's this guy's name? Henry something. What's his name? Let me look at my notes. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem about Paul Revere's ride in 1860, and it was published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1861. And that's how he was an obscure figure then in 1860, right? Like he was like a local folk hero in Massachusetts, not national fame whatsoever. And so it was this artist that brought it into, like, you know, the culture, right? Like into this kind of mythological space of, you know,
Right.
this revolutionary hero.
So the performance itself lasted about 45 minutes, and it kind of had a three-part structure first, but there was this beat, right? That was a through line, and that was sort of started with Jadelle, who was vocalizing a cappella in the garden and making a noise with a shaker. And then that transitioned to the beat with Farafina Khan, and then finally to the beat with Jogo. Can you talk about those three phases and why it was important to have them all together forming that through line for you?
Well, for me, I collaborated with Jadelle before. We worked together on some other projects, but this was like the first time we actually like really worked together, which was really nice. And I didn't realize that actually when I asked her, she had been doing her own research and went down a rabbit hole about someone who wrote about the last attack on the Capitol, which was in 1812. And it was an enslaved servant at the White House, I think in Madison's White House. And he actually wrote a book about what happened. And that ends up being like one of the only documents that documented what actually happened in that particular sacking of the Capitol. So she was already thinking about making, or writing music for this. And so then when I asked her to participate in this, it was like meeting of the minds, right? Like thinking about how can we call forth, history into the present, right? Or the contributions of ancestors into the present. And she sang, I think.
What was the brief that you gave her? Like,
I was like, can you just do what you do? I mean, when you hear her sing, you feel things, like you feel parts of yourself open up that you didn't even know that you knew were there, right? Like you feel something, right? That is not, I can't put into words, but
I had this feeling that she was, building space for all of us and kind of building it out and holding it and grounding it in that history, right? In the
exactly
layers of history where we were physically standing. Yeah. And then Farafina Khan was stationed at the cardinal points that you mentioned, sort of north, south, east, west in the garden. And then they start drumming in those points, sort of calling to each other and with each other. And then they slowly merged into the center. So yeah, talk about what they brought to this in terms of your thinking about the project.
I mean, I was really thinking about like, what does a liberation call sound like in West African drumming, right? And I think they said that they specifically chose Congolese war drumming to use for this particular performance. And the people that emancipated themselves in Stono Rebellion were from the Congo and Angola. So I think it was a direct reference to that particular history and trying to bring back sounds of the past into the present.
Mm-hmm. And then Jogo. Why was Go-Go an important?
I mean, Go-Go is DC, and Go-Go is DC, and that beat is a continuing beat, right? Like from Jadelle opening up and inviting ancestors that are ever present to be with us in the space and acknowledging, the words and the history of that, the 1812, sacking of the Capitol, and then, thinking through like different kinds of ongoing moments of liberation within American history for Black and Brown people, then through like this music, right? Like the music or the beat holds the history, right? And so then what is the history of go-go in DC, and how is it like such a local hyper specific music that is a continuation of all of these cultures, like, a conglomeration configuration of all of these things.
In its own way, very much linked to, or can be in certain moments, linked to calls for freedom too. I mean, in the summer of 2020, certainly go-go here in DC was a rallying point and became a kind of rallying cry around a lot of the Black Lives Matter marching and protests that were here in the city. It ended in a super joyful way, it felt like, in that garden. And then you also ended with a statement, which I will not make you repeat today word for word, but I did want to just sort of ask what it was important for you to acknowledge in that moment and in that statement.
Well, I think that that was also one of my original thoughts about the potential of this sculpture, right? Like that with each place that it would go to, I could bring forth more names from history, the names that will never make it into like, the like hollowed halls or have portraits of, these unknown names of people who actually pushed the dial of freedom forward. I think Martin Luther King says it in his last speech, right? Like that we just want you to be true to what you said on paper, right? Like the
Yeah.
press release is a beautiful thing, but in its action, right, it leaves a lot. It leaves us wanting a lot. But so in the Madison Square Park version, I found the names or discovered the names of the first Black people in New York City, which came, I think, in 1626 or something. So like very early on, Black people are a part, and they actually were also Angolan, part of New York history, period. And then saying their names and how they were able to purchase from the Dutch East India Company their partial freedom. So they were kind of free and kind of still enslaved, but then when the British came and took over New York, that was the end of that. And Black, they had owned lands in that moment, and all of their lands were confiscated within maybe a period of a couple decades. But that's why, I mean, that's why I said what I said in trying to name the few names that we have of the actors within the Stoner Rebellion, because for me they're the Paul Reveres, right?
Yeah. I do want to encourage anyone out there who has questions to make sure you ask them. In the meantime, I'm just going to keep peppering Abigail with my own. But since we have a little bit of time, maybe let's go to the observatory, because we've spoken about the Capitol, about the relationship to the events of January the 6th, about what it means to have Light of Freedom sharing space with the Capitol and oriented towards it. But it turns out that all the while, and even before January 6th of this year, you had been developing this piece that we're looking at right here. So can you talk to us about what it is that is on the screen?
Sure. So the observatory was part of that brand new Heavies exhibition at Pioneer Works this spring. But I've been thinking about the Capitol Dome somewhere in the middle of the Trump administration, and particularly thinking about the Libertas that was on top. And then actually then finding out all of this this history around the development or how that Liberty figure, yeah, I don't remember what her actual name is, but that the artist actually wanted there to be a Libertas, but somebody who was big in the Confederacy, who was like weighing in at the moment, said that that's not possible, right? That Americans actually aren't enslaved. So we're not going to have a Libertas at the top of the Capitol Dome building. But she can get like a helmet of war for, the goddess of war, I think Minerva. And then she was conflated with an Indian princess. And so I think that kind of composite or that kind of collage of ideals actually speaks more to like the heart of this democratic struggle, right? That it's predicated on the subjugation and obliteration of other peoples, right? Of like taking of lands and war, right? Like that it is continually, you continually maintain power through war. And, not this idea about, liberty being granted to everyone because this is a free place where you can live and breathe and, whatever.
Yeah. So you built out this armature of the Capitol. What is it made out of?
It's steel, and it's I'm trying to remember the scale. It's definitely less than half. I mean, it's like a baby version of the Capitol
Yeah.
Dome. I mean, it's very baby. It's like maybe it's like 20 feet high,
Mhm.
but in keeping in relation to proportions. And then thinking, like also trying to make this connection to the universe and thinking about patterns of the universe and how that's embodied within ourselves, but also the ways in which power architecture has been, or federalist architecture has been developed within this country in terms of looking, and specifically Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the original people who weighed in on the Capitol Dome and how it should be constructed and how it should be modeled after a Roman temple, right? And thinking about this, Greco-Roman relationship of, this idea of democracy and what that is, and then how we can legitimize, this effort. So yeah, so then it's covered in chicken wire, so it's kind of like a chicken coop, but it
Huh.
has all of these, holes like cut into it all over the place. So I was thinking about portals and slippages of time, and thinking about the ways in which, like, I think the early part of the universe was just pockets of gas and all of these. I'm
We're going back
forgetting one
to long
element.
history, long,
Yeah,
long.
but like, how black holes helped in the creation of the early part of the universe, and in and computerized simulation of that, it just looked like spider webs. So thinking about like spider webs or fingertips or, chicken wire, how all of these kinds of patterns are, embedded within us, but there's a longer kind of timeline that we're functioning on, that goes, like, harkens back to the origins of the universe and not necessarily contemporary struggles of power.
Mhm. And then what are we looking at? And then there are these flat
Mhm.
screen monitors that are sort of attached within the interior that you can see here and can kind of make out some of the imagery that's scrolling on those monitors. But can you tell us what's on there and why?
Yeah, so some of the images are actual black holes, but then others are a collection of videos that I shot when I went on a 10-day road trip with some friends in 2014, the summer of 2014, which actually during that road trip, Mike Brown's murder happened, because I never forget it, because we were on a plantation tour, a 10-day plantation tour in the South, and it was my first time.
10-day.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
my first time actually really going down south.
Yeah,
But
that's
so we started in DC and ended in Jacksonville, Florida, and stopping along the way on these, like, on main stops on the Seaboard Air
Mhm.
Line Railroad, which was like a main thoroughfare that people took during the Great Migration. But um yeah, I just wanted to see it for myself, like, to see what was standing, to feel what it felt like to be in those spaces, um, so it was the first time that I went into like a still standing, barn that was constructed by an enslaved architect, right? Like that designed and constructed in like 1860 at a plantation in outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, or being in some, like, there's very few, but they're still standing, slave quarters, right? Like, and feeling what those spaces felt like, or looking at the smudge of fingerprints on, on some wooden boards, or people constructed their homes out of reject bricks that had fingerprints embedded within them. So then you could see this laborer's, fingerprints inside of the brick. And so thinking about all those kinds of textures and patterning that link us through time. And so those are the kinds of things that were being shown on the monitors. And then also you can see here kind of that there's one that has water on it. And so that was at Sullivan Island, which was like a main port where I can't remember what the actual statistics are, but like a lot, it's almost like an Ellis Island of of Black people in
Yeah.
this nation. Yeah.
So did anything, because you were developing this work before January 6th, did anything about the events of January 6th adjust or tweak your thinking about the work or the way that the work eventually came together and took shape?
I think I didn't know what to do with that. I was
Yeah.
just like, oh no, people
Did
are
any
gonna
of
think this is this
Yeah.
is gonna be because people are gonna
Yeah.
think this is like an immediate response to January 6th. And I think because it felt like such a circus, or it was like such pageantry that was going on like simultaneously with this violence, that it was hard to reconcile those two things and insert that within this space. Because I'm thinking maybe about like a larger spectrum of time that we're operating on versus like, the last 5 years with the Trump administration and the fallout from that. So
Mhm.
no, I don't think any of that actually made it in here.
But people bringing their own, I mean, it's certainly front of mind for a lot of people coming in to that space and walking into that armature and feeling that. We do have a couple of questions. One is very straightforward. It asks where the work is headed from DC, after DC, and I don't think that we know yet what its next phase of life is, but I do know and can say that it will be on view in the garden through the middle of April 2022. So up until that point, I'll make a push for coming to visit often. And of course, if and when we know where its next life shall be, we'll make sure that that information becomes available. Is there a location or space that you would like it to go to, or that yeah.
Nah, I mean, I'm kind of down for it to go everywhere. And I think, I think I've heard things, but it's nothing is definite. Like there's a possibility of it going to St. Louis, Missouri. So maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another question about, which I think is interesting. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this, but I was wondering about, and this is from Regina Anderson. I was wondering about Abigail's thoughts on borderlands and borders in general when we think of North America as a continent, when we think about South America, et cetera, and the construction of borders to maintain power. And it says, are there colors or music or ideas?
About borders?
I think so. I think that's the
Colors, music, or ideas.
yeah.
I mean, well, actually, I mean, we know that these borders are all made up. We know they're not real. I mean, I guess they're real because people are being killed because of them. So, I mean, that's the bloodshed is what makes it real. But um I feel like maybe in the performance, I tried to touch on that a little bit, or like thinking about the ways in which all of these cultures have shaped this one culture, right? Like that American culture isn't actually like just consumerism or this like imperialist kind of, stretch for power. But I think it's also all of the people that have, you know, provided the texture, color, and like interesting things, right? Like the interesting or better parts of whatever American culture is. I think it's been through, these other voices that have sometimes existed at the margins. And I think there was something else that I was thinking about, which I don't know if this relates to your question at all, but there was a Washington Post article that I think was published September 7th in 2019, but talking about before 1619, there was 1526. So like, when the 1619, the 400th anniversary of, you know, Africans being brought as enslaved people to, Jamestown, Virginia was happening, right? In 1526, the Spanish brought maybe 100 captive people to somewhere between Georgia and South Carolina, and that was like a failed situation very quickly. But it's unknown as to what happened to the Africans that actually rebelled. That was the first, that's the first kind of rebellion that happened of enslaved people on this continent. And potentially, maybe, you know, in the ether, I don't know, but there could have been a collaboration with brown people that were, you know, indigenous communities that were there at that time. Nobody knows what happened to those Africans. They went into the woods and were never seen or heard from again. So I feel like there's all of these other mythologies or true stories that exist that are outside of our understanding and discolor the ways in which we think about these borders. Like I feel like the official kind of line drawing we know is not true. We can feel in our hearts it's not true. But I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out how we can have a fuller or deeper understanding of ourselves.
Mm. Thank you for that, for the question and the answer both. We have time for one more, so I will make it this one from Rita Cognian, and please forgive me if I've mispronounced that last name. But she writes that she's eager to see the work in person and asks, aside from sunrise, what time of day shows it to best advantage, which I'll be interested to hear your take on. But I also think it's interesting to consider the sculpture of light in relation to the light of day and various times of day and the lack of light. So maybe you can speak to that.
I mean, yes, of course. Sunrise was really beautiful. Just being there and the quiet. I just love sunrise anyway. I love sunrise and sunset, two best parts of the day. But I think early evening is nice. Maybe if you can be there around sunset, so you get the, you know, the drama of the fireball going down, but also, you know, then it's actually lit with a blue light from within inside the arms, and then it's lit from underneath. So I think nighttime might be one of my favorite.
Nighttime is very beautiful, especially since daylight savings over the weekend. The sun is down when the garden closes, but you are still able to see in and down into the garden. And with the sculpture illuminated, it becomes a really it becomes a definite beacon. It's got a lot of presence. Abigail, is there anything else you want us to know in closing before I thank you again profusely?
Let me see here. Is there another question? Oh yeah. No, I'm good.
Okay. Well, then I will thank you. I thank my colleagues, Amy and Rebecca. Thanks to Maura and Claire for their assistance with interpretation and captioning tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to Madison Square Park Conservancy and Brooke Rappaport in particular. And we look forward to seeing everyone for our next live online artist talk, which will be on November 23rd. So thanks again to one and all, and have a great night. And thank you, Abigail.
Thank you.